example you just gave, that they have issues with others and sometimes with large firms, but the lawyer fee is greater than the fee you're claiming.
It is their right.
Yes.
A right, the right that someone has. All our rights exist in context.
What is the context of a second medical opinion?
Because you're disrespecting the process.
No.
Jesus, this is common sense, man.
Any situation which you seem to do, you just dealing with Afro-Guyanese issues. If one, you can't bring and pull the leaders of the African community together, you're failing. And if two, you can't put forward a future, a blueprint, and a plan for African Guyanese, you're failing as well.
Pleasant evening to you. We're on independence. This is the 6th year of independence, and that is our featured topic this evening. There are only two persons that may be the best eligible persons in Guyana and the diaspora to talk about 60 years of independence, and that's because of their long experience, and then they became president. So what more you want than a president of Guyana who was born before independence, who was a teenager independence, and their life went on till they became president. Those two persons are Mr. David Granger, because of his age and because he became the leader of one of the two big parties in Guyana, the PNC, and then he became the president. And the other one was a longer experience in politics than Mr. Granger, which I think would make him the more eligible than Mr. Granger to speak on 60 years of independence. Of course, there is Hamilton Green, but he was never president of Guyana. There are three other presidents: Sam Hines, Barajat Dio, and Alfred Ali. Sam Hines' presidency only lasted 6 months. So that leaves Barajat Dio and Alfred Ali, but they were not born in 1966 or before 1966 or shortly after 1966. So that leaves David Granger and Donald Ramotar. As I said before, when you examine the two men's history, Donald Ramotar would be in front because he was in politics much longer than David Granger. Here to talk about 60 years of independence is a man who came from humble beginnings in the Essequibo and achieved the apogee of politics of becoming the leader of his party, and then the apogee of national office, the presidency of Guyana. Our guest this evening to take Guyanese in Guyana, the diaspora, and the young generation of Guyana, over 88% not born before 1966 or shortly after 1966. So, without further ado, His Excellency, the former President of Guyana, Donald Ramotar, will take us through 60 years of independence. Donald, once again, thanks for being here, His Excellency. Let's start with what was Donald Ramotar doing, or what he remembered on Independence Day and Independence Night?
Well, on Independence Day, found me in Carriacaria, living in Carriacaria at the time.
You have to tell our guests where is Carriacaria.
Carriacaria is on the west bank of the Essequibo River, not on the coast. Don't get mixed up with the coast. It's within the river itself, between Supanam and Bartica. That's where it is. Closer to Supanam than to Bartica. I was there. I remember Independence Day itself. My father used to be involved in timber operation. He had a timber plant that he operated, small operation. And my brothers were in the timber plant. I was asked by my father to paddle a boat from the Essequibo River into the Arawari Creek, bring them out to the district on Independence Day to celebrate, and any other persons were in the area that wanted to come out. That is how I spent Independence Day, 1960.
Now you're getting on in age, and we're in the 70s, 4 years after independence. That's a very controversial period. What was that like? Because you need, at our age, you need to tell the young people, so young our operators are. You need to tell them.
The first thing I believe that we should talk about independence is what was the state of the country when Guyana became. Guyana is the only country in the Commonwealth that got independence with a state of emergency and political prisoners that we had. At the time of independence, we had about 16 persons in detention at Sibley Hall in the Mazaruni River, including T.V. Noons, who was then a political prisoner. In fact, Noons got very sick while in detention. He contracted asthma and he eventually had to migrate out of the country. He died in England 2 years ago. So I want people to understand that our nation was born under a period of very undemocratic, as I said, a state of emergency in place. And the independence that we got, while it was celebrated, and we think it's a great achievement because of the long struggle that we in the PPP put up, the generation of the PPP put up to win independence. We must also remember that some of the dreams that we dreamed of independence was not then available. I remember also that from the very beginning there was resistance and fight for democracy, even on Independence Day. When the first parliament was convened, where the instruments were handed over for independence, PPP members of parliament, led by Dr. Jagan, walked from Freedom House to the Parliament building to attend that first meeting with placards around their necks, one on the back and one in the front and the chest, with written on it, "Free the detainees now." And they walked right up to the Parliament with that, and were not allowed to go into the Parliament, so they had to take it off at the door of the Parliament before they entered National Assembly. So that is how our nation was born, and I want to make that point to emphasize how far we have come since then, because of when we were born. You talk about the question of the 1970s. You raised that issue, and it was a very, very difficult period. Actually, from 1968, the first elections were held in independent Guyana, and the People's National Congress that was in charge at the time of the independence, and they got the majority in the National Assembly by a lot of people crossing the floor, either by bribery or by coercion, including former Minister of the United Force. When they were a coalition, that is what gave them the majority that they needed. A man by the name of Mohammed Qasim, who was Minister
of Hydraulics.
Minister of Works and Hydraulics at the time. And Digar wanted him sacked because Digar said that he couldn't account for $5 million. That was a lot of money at that time. In today's money, it would be quite a lot of money. And then Prime Minister, Mr. Burnham, got up and said, "I authorized it." And without giving any explanation what the money was spent for, and Qasim crossed the floor to give the PNC the majority, and Llewellyn John, who was then the first Minister of Home Affairs, had all the powers in his hand, and that elections, together with some operatives from the United States that were here at the time, the CIA actually, they rigged the first election in Guyana in 1968. So the government started to become more and more unpopular. They started with an economic program, a kind of a pro-capitalist, pro-private sector business program for Guyana, and they were becoming so unpopular because things were getting bad in the country that in 1970 they changed their slogan and started to begin to speak about cooperative socialism. I believe that they took that line because the opposition to them was fundamentally from a more left socialist party perspective, and they wanted to try to take away that mantle from the PPP by trying to see if they could embrace the PPP's politics. Of course, they failed miserably because things began to get worse and worse, and they began to run the country by slogans: feed clothes and house the country, small man will be a real man, and a lot of slogans, but things began to get worse and worse. So much so that in 1968, when the elections were rigged, the main form that was used was padding the voters list with fictitious names, and also with dead people's names on it. And they still had to do some breaking into the ballot box, because in the 1968 elections in the Pomeroon area, when the boxes were opened, turned out the votes were thrown onto the table to be counted. 25 wads of ballot paper wrapped in rubber bands fell out on the table to be counted. And so that shows you that the elections were and then they introduced at that time overseas voting, and there's a film by the Granada television that is called The Making of the Prime Minister, that exposed the whole fraudulent thing about the 1968 elections. And then by 1973, the situation began even worse, because the methods that they used in 1968 were not enough for them to win the elections, and they had to resort to use the army to seize the ballot boxes and to give themselves the two-thirds majority in 1973 to change the constitution and all of that. So things started to get very, very tough as they became more and more unpopular. They became more and more undemocratic. Not only were they rigging elections as a manifestation of their undemocratic nature, but they also was controlling everything. They rigged the Amerindian capital elections, trade union elections, everything they wanted to control, because they felt afraid and not being able to afford democracy in the society at that time. So it was a very, and by the end of the 1970s, 1978, when the elections were supposed to be held, the PNC postponed the elections on the grounds that they want to write a new constitution and set up to write a new constitution, what they were calling the socialist constitution this time. And elections were postponed until 1980, and again in 1980, the rigging was massive in order to keep the PNC in government with the same type of method used about seizing the ballot boxes and changing.
So that's the immediate post-1966 period. So independence then didn't start well.
No, actually, we, as I said, we started with a state of emergency. We started with political prisoners, and then we had repression at every stage. I mean, you had workers were being put down. Workers' strikes were being put down in many, many ways, and that was particularly in the sugar industry, but it also began to occur in the bauxite industry as well. When the PNC nationalized the bauxite industry, I think in a way they were forced to nationalize the bauxite industry because the company refused to have any participation, any government participation within the industry. And if the PNC had backed down at that time, they would have lost a lot of faith. So they were forced to take over the industry. And when they took over the industry, they found that they give themselves a lot of power because they were now controlling employment. And what they did and caused the industry to actually be run down was to have a big overemployment. All their supporters, they were trying to give jobs to who were trying to satisfy some of their supporters' needs and so forth, giving them jobs. That created a terrible amount of inefficiency in the system and the collapse of the bauxite industry. But for the PNC itself, I think it gave them the feeling of real power, and that is why they moved to take over the sugar industry. I don't think it was a philosophical, ideological decision on their part to do that, because they never tried to democratize the management or anything of the industry. I think they took it over as a form of control, give them a greater control among the masses at the time, controlling employment. So we were born, our independence was born in a very difficult circumstances, unlike any other independence, probably with the exception of Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe. But there was no other country in the Commonwealth that I can think about and that was born in such economic and not more the political situation that was so undemocratic and got worse as time.
So one can say the independence didn't augur well for Guyana's political economy.
I would not blame independence for that. I think that despite the fact that the PPP felt robbed, and remember the slogan of the PPP at that time was cheated and not defeated. That was the slogan that the PPP had, which I think captured what was happening at the time of in the elections, when we said we were cheated and not defeated. And but independence was a big step forward in the life of this country. At least we got rid of one form of oppression on us, the colonial oppression, and we now had to deal with the local oppression, even though they were allied with some other foreign interests and so forth. But one major obstacle was removed in the struggle for a better governance, or a better life in our country. So from that point of view, I wouldn't say that independence, it was what the term you used just now, but to say it was a great step forward, even though the PPP was not in government at the time when independence came. The PPP still, I think, rightfully feel that independence came about as a result of their struggle fundamentally, although many of the dreams that we had were supported by the way we got it.
But don't you think that that kind of post-independence behavior, autocracy, repression, oppression, the rigging of elections, denying of people right to vote, don't you think it would have caused PPP supporters to say, this is what independence was?
So I think it had a lot to do with leadership. I think the leadership that Dr. Jagan and the people provided for the masses, because Dr. Jagan never, while he appreciated his own charisma and he appreciated the love that people had for him, he never depended on those things. He never saw those things as lasting. And he always wanted to have conscious people to understand what was at stake, what was the nature of the struggle, And therefore, he spent a lot of time in educating, first of all, membership of the people, the masses of the people. Created a party school, sent people away to study political science and so forth, party activists, and also at the same time used to be holding regular public meetings in the villages all over the country, and took a lot of time to explain some of the most complex local and international issues so that the ordinary man would understand. I think he believed very fervently that a conscious member of the party or a conscious supporter of the party was very important in order for us to win back government and to fight against some of the methods that the PNC was using, particularly racism, and to maintain their support. Thought that education was the main, the word antidote to prevent those things and to stop it and to be able to turn it around when the time comes.
Do you think our independence motions, our independence, integrity, would have been preserved for us to reach 60 years if, as some people claim, the PPP should have tried to overthrow Burnham? One of Jaganite, and I say Jaganite because it comes from Jaganite outlook, but I think Jagan himself said it. You were playing with civil war if the PPP had tried to overthrow Burnham. You were playing with a race war.
Dr. Jagan didn't want to. Dr. Jagan never saw power as an end in itself. He always saw power as a means to another end to build a different type of society, build a society of justice and so forth. So that is why he patiently worked among the masses, bring them to their understanding what was taking place, and to get them conscious of the need to struggle against what the PNC was doing. He would not have started, not that he was a pacifist and he was against any kind of struggle and so forth, but he didn't want to do anything that could further inflame some of the problems that arose during the struggle of independence, mainly the racial question. He recognized that it would have taken a long time, but there was no shortcut to the whole issue of trying to lift the consciousness of the Guyanese against what was happening, to make them see that race was being used to obfuscate the real problems within the society, to cover those problems, and the need, therefore, to a lot of political education work to be done. In fact, one of the splits that took place in the PPP immediately after the party came out of government, or shortly after the party came out of government, 1968, when Ben departed from the he left the PPP for political ideological reasons. And his argument at the time in the PPP was that we should not, in 1964-65, that we should continue, we should try to fight the PNC, since the PNC had now gotten into government, should not allow them to consolidate themselves and to carry the fight to them, that they were vulnerable and we could probably win that fight. But Dr. Jagan's argument against that was that the struggle for independence had degenerated large way and ended up in racial clashes. And more of that will make it even more difficult in the future to bring the races together, which was necessary in order to fight for the real freedom, the second independence, I would say, that came in 1992. That he thought it would be much more different. And I think that he's right when you look back at the history, because you remember by 1973, the PNC had to rig the elections, I told you, worse than they did in 1968. They used the army to take the ballot box, which reflected the growing dissatisfaction within the society as a whole. And that created the ideal type of conditions when Rodney appeared on the scene in 1974. And one of the reasons that Walter Rodney became so popular in 1974, because he was saying some of the same things that Dr. Jagan was saying, but his strength was that the very fact that he was African Guyanese, the PNC couldn't use the race card against him. But it was very clear by 1973 that the situation had arisen in Guyana where there was, people were beginning to come together more and more to oppose the PNC regime for what was happening. And then later on in the 80s, we saw developing, in 1978 actually, we saw the CDC, the Committee for the Defense of Democracy, during the time of the referendum that called a boycott of the referendum when only 10% of the people were out to vote, which shows a massive growing unity among the population. And then later on, you had dissatisfaction developing within the working class movement, and you had forming the 4 Union movement, then the 6 Union movement. Then you had unity at the religious level with the 2 bishops, Bishop George and Bishop Benedict Singh, and other religious organizations coming together. So I think, although it was a long wait, 28 years wait, I still think that Dr. Jagan was visionary and recognized that trying to force changes when conditions were not there would have been very dangerous for the whole of our society. And finally, I think we mustered enough unity to make the change that we made in 1990.
Do you think it was an anticlimax that independence was finally achieved? There is Guyana that doesn't have a colonial office running in Seville, but look what it turned out.
But I think it was.
Where was the exuberance? 66 is independence, 68 people being brutalized. I was a polling agent for the PPP in the 68 election at St. Thomas More Primary School in Garwood Street, and what I saw was very frightening. If you open your mouth, people want to beat you in the school.
Yeah. Well,
and that's 2 years after independence.
Yeah. Well, all of that showed that time was an important factor in allowing people to learn from their own experiences. That many people were fighting against their own interests in supporting the PNC. Many working people were going against their own interests because of the racial propaganda that existed at the time, and the fear that the PNC was able to generate among Afro-Guyanese working people, to make them fear that if the PPP government, they will take revenge from what the PNC will do them and all of that. So time was a very, very important factor. And then we, as I said, we saw from 1964 to 1973, the PPP was fighting almost alone. There was no other force aligned with the PPP. But from 1973, after the regular elections, different forces began to arise, and the PPP was working with them like fellow travelers. We were working together and breaking off sometimes with disagreements and so forth. But it was a important period to give people to learn by their own experiences that the PNC was not necessarily having their interests at heart, and they eventually ended up running the country for a small elite charge of the society at that point in time. I also think, in order not to oversimplify things too, because Burnham was a very complex figure. He started out being on the left, said that he was even a member of the Communist Party of Britain when he was a youngster in England. In fact, he was recommended to Dr. Jagan by one Billy Stratton, who was heading the CLC Government Labours, as a good man to work with Dr. Jagan together. Then he swung and he was working with the British here in Guyana, and he was one of the main persons that instigated, together with his party, instigated racism within the society and so forth. But I also think that coming to the end of his career, the last 5 years of his life, I think, that he was probably reflecting deeply on his own past. And I believe that he was trying to, this is a subjective factor and it's only my opinion, but I think that he was trying to live down his past that he had by dividing the national movement and several other things that he did.
Rodney's dead.
And he was also trying to live down those things. Because when you look at when he, in 1985, for the first time since the split of the PPP in 1955, January of 1985, it was the PNC, his leadership, that initiated the talks with the PPP to have a joint government. And if you examine the situation at that time, you will see that his options were extremely limited. And I therefore think that they would, had he lived past August, when he unfortunately passed, that I believe that the possibility of unity emerging would have been possible, because I think he didn't have, when I examine the time, when I reflect on the time of 1985 and what options he had after he broke relationship with the World Bank and IMF and so forth, his options were very, very limited. And therefore his appeal to try to create talks with the PPP, find a political solution after PPP had been making these calls from the time the split occurred and now the first time he made it. I think that probably there was a level of genuineness there that probably could have made the development of this country different had he been. Fortunately, he passed, and that's not how it abandoned that road completely to go back to the pro-imperialist position that they had taken at the time of it.
Well, that, I'm wondering if you should put that in writing, because that has never been enunciated before by any major non-PNC politician or even any major non-PPP intellectual or politician. I think what you have just adumbrated is a first. I haven't read, and believe me, because of my work, I have to people seeking to everything that is written, that Mr. Burnham was redeeming himself. That is a first. That is an iconoclastic, revisionist piece of political history. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because I'd like to hear your thoughts on one dimension of that particular political nuance that began at the beginning of 1985. There is one account, now there is your account, but it's not.
My views, my opinion.
Well, that's your opinion. But there was one account that documents what was going on between the two parties at that time, and that's Khalid Majid, who was secretary to the talks from the PNC side. The PPP would have had their secretary. Khalid Majid has a book which I'm absolutely sure you have read. And in that book he said, Mrs. Jagan stayed away. She didn't want anything to do with it. is it possible that she felt that Burnham was trying to get out of a quagmire which was like sinking him in some sand? And she had that reservation?
I don't
But
think,
you mentioned that in the book.
I don't think, I'm not sure how Halim come to some of those countries, but I don't think he was involved in all of the talks. I think there's one man.
You were?
No, I wasn't. But I know there's one person that I know deeply involved.
Mr. Rohini?
Rohi was involved too, but there's Feroz Mohammed was, he passed away, and the other person who was alive is Robert Corbyn, who I think Feroz and Robert Corbyn were mandated by the two parties to have a lot of contacts with each other. So the two of them had a lot of important information that was never really.
So Majid didn't have access to that because he didn't put it out.
Right. Majid probably came at a much later stage. Came at a much later stage in those kind of developments. And I don't think Mrs. Jagan did any. I know that at one time she walked out of a meeting largely because I understand that that there was some language that was used that was not very pleasant language, and she walked out of that meeting. But it wasn't walked out because of political reasons. She disagreed.
That's a meeting concerning the dialogue.
A very close meeting at the
concerning the dialogue.
The house of the Prime Minister in Belfield.
So that would be the house of the president.
No, he was president then. Yes, it was his house that took place. But
he was the man cursing himself.
Anyway, I want to go into the thing, but I heard that secondhand. I wasn't there, but I heard that she didn't leave because she disagreed with any political.
Majid didn't.
I don't think Majid was there that meeting. He probably heard that they probably tried to. Janet Jagan was one of the persons who was blamed for everything. That one, Cherry, I think Cherry had such a prestige within the society. Was so loved. He went across the board, and even when Afro-Guyanese wasn't voting for him, I still think they had that love and respect for him because of the whole history that he had, and they knew him. Not that it wasn't someone that they knew. So Cherry was hardly personally criticized. If you look at the time, they were always blaming someone else. With Brinley Ben, with Janet Jagan, or somebody else, always being blamed and so forth. Largely because I think there was a feeling in the opposition strategists, don't attack Jagan directly because
he's too much of a loved figure, too much of a reverend
right,
figure.
people might just
turn up.
Yeah. So I don't think Janet was opposed to any of the direction that the party was taking. Many people try to say that, but that is totally.
Halim Majid brought that out in his book.
I don't think he's right.
The former Minister of Labour on this program as part of the discussing the 60th anniversary. When asked about the two things that he felt was damage to our independence dream, was the scrapping of the railway and the rigging of national elections. You were very much a young political activist in charge with the ontology of the PPP. What are your two, or if there are more than two? For Joseph Hamilton, it's scrapping of the railway. He thought that was a disaster.
I think the basis of all of that was the lack of democracy within the country. But the suppression of the people's will. And even when the PNC probably did things with good intentions, it didn't work the way they had hoped it would have worked. Largely because I think they didn't have the support of the people. They weren't carrying the people with with them, and maybe the style of government, style of governance, on reflection of it. Was very important. Let's take, for instance, when they introduced free education. No one in the right sense will say that Burnham did that with any malice or any intention. He had obviously had good intention when he introduced.
Yeah, because I couldn't go to high school. You had to pay for high school.
Because some schools you had to be paid for.
Most of the high schools.
But having said that, I will say that it turned out to be a disaster in a sense because either the country was not ready for it yet, but maybe we didn't have the resources for that completely as yet. And you remember Discipline Beard, who was a former Minister of Education in 1974, I think she said the vast majority of children were leaving and could not read and write properly. And that was, so free education, which was, in my view, was done with good intentions, maybe trying to rectify a historical wrong that existed within the society, did not bring the kind of results that we wanted. We felt we went right down to the bottom of the ladder and passing at CXC examinations and many other areas we went down. So I would say, I wouldn't go to two. I would tell you the fundamental basis of it was the lack of democracy. As that had an impact on everything else.
It's 60 years. That's a long time. I read one source that says it's 90% of the country that is under 60. That 10% is over 60. So
we're the 10% category.
Yeah. So we have so much institutional memory that we need to look at the young operators. We need to tell them about where we came from. But what about where we are at the moment? You satisfied that it's 60 years, after 60 years, you satisfy as a former leader of the PPP, a former successful trade unionist, and most of all, a former president.
I think there's a lot to be proud of that has been accomplished over the years. And particularly since 1992, I think our country was growing slowly, not necessarily slowly, but at a fairly good clip. And even in when I was president for 3.5 years, in very, very difficult circumstances with an opposition that was fighting against everything, we still grew at an average of 5%, which was at that time extremely good. And I think now what the government is doing as far as infrastructure is concerned is something that we badly needed all the time in order to ensure that our economy and our country continue forward, both now and when oil would have been finished, that the infrastructure that is being created now will help to sustain a good economic growth to give our people, future generation, a good living. So I agree. I think a lot of that has been achieved. But there's something there, the old saying, the more things change, the more
That's
they tend to
an
remain
old
the
friend
same.
saying.
Yeah,
But
and
it can't be true in Guyana after 60
it
years.
is true to some extent because in 1966, when we became independent, we hardly had any control of our economy. And if you look now at the structure of our economy, it's fundamentally in the hands of foreigners, the oil companies, the mining companies, and so forth are there. I think we have to examine how do we fight to get a bigger share of the pie so that we can do more. I think a lot has been done, no doubt about that. No argument, no debate about that. much more could be done if we get a bigger stake in our economy and a greater control economy than we have.
So in this holistic pattern of positive independence things, would you like to, I know you've done it in a general way, in a holistic way just now. You could quickly identify 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things.
I prefer keeping it at the holistic, at the holistic position, I would say. I would just make those general statements. I think a lot of admirable things are being done now. The social sector, in health, in education, in many other areas, some of the things that we do are fantastic. And in some areas, we are catching up very rapidly with the developed countries, some of the services that are. But as I said, I still believe fields of economics need to find ways and means where we will have stronger control and greater share, particularly in our natural resources. These are wasting assets. These are not things that go up.
You may get criticized after this program is aired for that strong analogy in the use of the French term. The more things change, the more they remain the same. It's a bit poignant.
In some ways, it is true. As far if you compare the control that we had of our economy in 1966 and now, I think it can actually say that. Although, of course,
the French term applies there.
It applies.
More things change, the more you remain the same. But don't you think that people may say that's Guyana changing and that's Guyana opening up to the world and investment coming in, and that's the reality 60 years after independence?
People would probably say that, but I am not speaking. I'm speaking my opinion that I think that even though we can show a lot of what we have done, we can show so much that we have achieved since independence, and particularly since 2020. I still think that much more could be achieved with what I've just said.
And you feel that is a little blocked on 60 years of independence?
I'm not calling it a block, but I'm saying it is something that has to be considered, has to be taken into account, and has to be worked on. Is it not being in government and not having all the information that in government will have? Is it impossible at this time to do that? If it is impossible at this time to do that, what is the thinking, forward thinking about what method and so forth we can use, start to pull back some things in our direction?
But you would like to see that. Let's put it this way. At 60 years of independence, former President Donald Ramotar feels that one of the regretful moments in the life of Guyana is that we don't have sufficient control over our resources in the context of what we had before.
Even forgetting what we had before, because I mean, I said some people could come and tell me that okay, you had control of the bauxite industry when you mash it up, you had control of sugar and the Stevens crisis and so on. That's a different issue, that's a different question. But I suspect that there are all kinds of models that exist in various parts of the world what China is doing, what Vietnam is doing, and many of these places that are moving very rapidly, how they're doing, what they're doing. Is it taxation policies? Is it a different form of ownership? Are we trying to think about other kinds of ownership that we can probably use? Are we thinking about new form of public ownership? Different. I think those. What I'm speaking about is
You mentioned taxation and the operator signal. Our time is going, so I want to get this in because you mentioned taxation. Mr. Ralph Famkaran, who I think still remains a personal friend of yours, he is against most unqualifyingly, he's against the abolition of property tax because he said it has come at the wrong time. It has come at a time where you really need it now because the society has generated a humongous amount of rich people. And that property tax, if retained, allows the state to have money. So he's saying it's ironic that Nicholas Calder, the budget director in 1962, brought it in, and now in 2025, it's been abolished at a time when it should be retained, because look how much wealth is there.
Yeah, and then
I
agree with that completely. Unreservedly, I agree with that because people who are putting up the kind of property that we see obviously are people who could afford to pay property tax.
But what could have been?
But these are the same people who will benefit from all of the services, the new roads, the highways, the new governance issue, all that is being laid out for services. And so I think that they should pay more, make a bigger contribution. And I think they should feel good about it, particularly local business. Foreigners will always try to hide it, not to do it. Put a lot of pressure to get them to do it. But local business people should feel good about paying their fair share of taxes to make a contribution to the kind of
that the operator signal that we about a minute over.
That's a good point to end it on.
Thanks for being with us. You have a blank check on this program to appeal, to adumbrate, enunciate, elaborate, elongate on the ideological perspective of Donald Ramotar. Just pick up the phone and call. Thanks for being with us. And great talking to you. I just interviewed former President of Guyana, Mr. Donald Ramotar, on 60 years of independence. This program was brought to you inside the Chelly Jagan Research Library or Institute, which is housed in the iconic building named Red House, which was the home of Premier Chelly Jagan. Thanks for being with us. As I normally say, catch you later. Bye-bye.